Hegnes Fjord, a small village in northern Europe, was trapped in a perpetual layer of snow during the long winters. The train station, a dark brick building with a covered platform, was the heart of the village's connection to the rest of the world. However, on the cold winter nights, the station seemed more like an abandoned place than a transit point. Kjell Hansen, a man in his 50s, had worked as a security guard at the station for over 20 years. He was a methodical and serious man, always finding a logical explanation for events that others might consider strange. At the end of November 2003, on an especially freezing night, Kjell was in his office watching the security cameras. A shadow briefly crossed the screen showing the women's bathroom. It was a strange movement, but Kjell attributed it to fatigue and decided to check it out. When he arrived at the bathroom, he found both doors open, but there was no one inside. He checked every corner, even behind the doors and in the stalls. Everything was empty. He sighed and returned to his office, dismissing the incident as an illusion caused by the long hours. But that would not be the last time he saw shadows. As the weeks passed, Kjell began to notice more things. Footsteps echoing in the empty platform, muffled whispers blending with the wind's whistle, and shadows slipping across the cameras. Yet he always found an excuse: the wind creeping through the cracks, light reflections, or his own exhaustion. One night, a young woman arrived at the station, and it all began when a loud bang echoed through the platform. Kjell was checking the cameras when he heard the noise, and though he tried to ignore it, the thud repeated with even greater intensity. Armed with a flashlight, he stepped out into the cold night to investigate. Upon reaching the platform, he found a young woman huddled on one of the benches. Her hair was tangled, her clothes dirty, and her eyes reflected deep exhaustion. At first, he thought she was an intruder, but when she looked up at him, there was no fear or aggression in her gaze, only resignation.
"What are you doing here?"
Kjell asked, keeping his tone firm.
"I have nowhere to go,"
she replied, her voice weak, barely a whisper. Kjell hesitated, then asked,
"What's your name?"
"Ingrid,"
she said softly, her tone barely audible over the whistling wind. Kjell sighed. Although station rules prohibited anyone staying at night, the expression on the young woman's face disarmed him. He didn't have the energy to throw her out.
"You can't stay here all night,"
he finally said.
"But, if you need a safe place, go to the waiting room. There, you'll be protected from the wind."
Ingrid nodded her thanks with a slight tilt of her head and headed into the station. Kjell followed with the flashlight, making sure she didn't try anything suspicious. But when she sat down on one of the benches in the waiting room, she simply closed her eyes, exhausted. Over the following weeks, Ingrid began appearing more often. Though they barely spoke, Kjell grew accustomed to her presence. She was strange but not bothersome. She spent the nights in the waiting room trying to stay out of sight and disappeared before dawn. Gradually, Ingrid and Kjell started sharing some conversations. Ingrid told him, without going into too many details, that she had come to the village looking for temporary refuge. It was clear she had been living on the streets for a long time, but she never explained how she had ended up that way. Kjell didn't ask. It wasn't in his nature to pry beyond what was necessary. However, something changed in September. Ingrid began noticing the strange sounds in the station, the same ones Kjell had learned to ignore. One night, as she took shelter in the waiting room, she asked,
"Do those footsteps always sound like they're on the roof?"
Kjell looked at her, surprised.
"It's just the wind."
"No. It doesn't sound like wind,"
Ingrid insisted. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was firm. Kjell avoided answering. He didn't want to fuel her fears, or his own. On the morning of September 10th, the body of Eric Lund, a well-known blacksmith in the village, was found on the platform. His injuries were strange, as if something had torn him apart, yet there were no signs of a struggle. The most unsettling detail was that his face displayed an expression of absolute terror. The discovery shocked the village. Hegnes Fjord was a peaceful place, and the idea of such a brutal crime was inconceivable. The police launched an investigation, but they found no conclusive evidence. Kjell was questioned as part of the procedure, but there were no grounds to suspect him. Days later, another body was discovered, that of Anders Holt, a young carpenter. The circumstances were nearly identical, and fear began to spread like wildfire. The station, once a safe place, became the center of suspicion and gossip. On September 19th, tragedy struck even closer to home. Astrid Nygaard, an elderly and deeply religious woman, was found dead on the platform. Kjell had spoken to her that very night when he saw her silently praying on one of the benches. There had been nothing unusual in her behavior, but her death was as brutal as the others. Panic gripped the village as fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire. The brutal murders were unlike anything Hegnes Fjord had ever experienced, and the lack of answers only fueled the villagers' paranoia. For Kjell and Ingrid, the weight of suspicion became unbearable. As the only ones present at the station during the nights, they found themselves at the center of the villagers' growing distrust. Greta Ashim, a well-respected figure in the community, came to Kjell's defense. She vouched for his integrity and years of hard work, insisting he could never commit such atrocities. But Ingrid wasn't as fortunate. To the villagers, she was an outsider, a mysterious figure who had arrived just before the killings began. Whispers and accusations followed her wherever she went. One night, unable to bear the tension, Ingrid confronted Kjell in the dimly lit waiting room.
"Do you think I did this?"
she asked, her voice trembling, not with anger but with fear and desperation. Kjell met her gaze seriously.
"I know you didn't," he said firmly. "I spent the entire night watching the security cameras while you slept. Taking care of this old train station is my job, and besides, you never left this room last night. But honestly, this place is strange. There's something about it I can't explain."
Ingrid said nothing, her silence heavy with unspoken emotions. A single tear traced its way down her cheek, the first Kjell had seen since her arrival. He felt a pang of guilt but was unsure how to offer comfort. In that moment, the shadows of the station seemed closer than ever, pressing in on both of them. On the night of September 20th, after the funerals of the three deceased, Ingrid decided to stay in Kjell's office. He offered her the place, knowing that the tension in the village would prevent her from sleeping peacefully. The office was silent, except for the low hum of the monitors and the faint creaking of the wind hitting the windows. Ingrid rested in a chair, wrapped in her blanket, while Kjell watched the cameras intently. Fatigue was beginning to overcome him, but he couldn't afford to close his eyes, not after what he had seen the night before. Around 2 a.m., a movement on the monitor caught his attention. The figure on the camera that focused on the bathrooms was clearer this time. It seemed to be a woman dressed in a dark, old-fashioned outfit, almost out of place. She stood motionless near the women's bathroom door, her posture rigid and unnatural. Kjell felt a knot in his stomach. He gently woke Ingrid, but with urgency.
"Ingrid, wake up. Listen to me. I'm going to investigate, but you stay here. Lock the door and don't come out for any reason, understood?"
Ingrid nodded, still drowsy, but the fear in Kjell's voice jolted her awake. She locked the door while Kjell grabbed his flashlight and his small revolver, which he always carried for precaution. As he approached the bathrooms, the cold seemed to intensify, as if the air itself had become heavier. Both doors were open, swinging slightly from the icy draft. Kjell entered slowly, his flashlight illuminating the corners of the women's bathroom. It was empty as usual, but something felt wrong. When he turned to leave, a thick, deep, and macabre voice filled the hallway. The words were unintelligible, more of a distorted murmur that resonated directly in his chest. He froze and turned toward the source of the sound. In a corner of the hallway, he saw what appeared to be the silhouette of the woman, partially obscured by the dim light.
"Hey, you! Stop right now!"
Kjell shouted firmly, his voice echoing through the corridor as he readied his weapon. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved quickly, gliding unnaturally down the hall. Kjell fired, the echo of the shots reverberating through the walls. But the bullets seemed to have no effect, as though they passed through something intangible. He chased after the entity, his nerves on edge. As he rounded the corner, the figure disappeared, but what he saw next froze him in place. His office door was open. Desperate, he ran toward it, calling for Ingrid, but the office was empty. Ingrid's blanket still lay on the chair, but she was gone. He turned to the monitors, and what he saw on the screen made his blood run cold. Ingrid was walking slowly toward the tracks.
Ingrid!
He shouted, rushing out of the office. He sprinted down the platform, and when he reached her, he saw that Ingrid was walking slowly, as if in a trance, toward the edge of the platform. Kjell tried to stop her, but when he touched her shoulder, she didn't react.
Ingrid, stop!
He pleaded, shaking her lightly. Then he heard her voice, barely a whisper, but filled with an emotion he couldn't identify.
Mother! Mother!
A chill ran down Kjell's spine. He looked toward where Ingrid was staring, and that's when he saw it. The entity was there, standing in the middle of the tracks. Its form, which had initially appeared vaguely human, began to distort before his eyes. Its face elongated, its eyes hollowed into empty sockets, and a grotesque, mocking smile spread across its mouth.
You can't save her.
The entity murmured, though Kjell couldn't tell if the words came from it or if they resonated directly in his mind. Kjell fought to hold on to Ingrid, but she was stronger than she appeared in her trance. With one final movement, she broke free and fell onto the tracks, just as the night train illuminated her face with blinding light.
Ingrid, no!
Kjell shouted, watching her disappear. The entity's laughter echoed throughout the station, an unnatural sound that burned itself into his mind like an open wound. When the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate Hegnes Fjord, the police officers arrived at the station after receiving calls from neighbors who had heard gunshots during the night. Upon entering, they found bullet marks on the walls of the hallway and an unsettling coldness that seemed to have settled in the place. They searched for Kjell in his office, but he was not there. Finally, as they reached the platform, they saw him. Kjell was sitting beside the tracks, holding Ingrid's lifeless body in his arms. His coat was covered in snow and blood, but he remained motionless as if in his own trance.
Kjell Hansen, release the body!
One of the officers said, approaching cautiously. Kjell raised his gaze, his eyes empty, as though something inside him had broken irreparably. He said nothing as they handcuffed him and pulled him away from Ingrid. The rumors in the village spread quickly. For some, Kjell had gone mad, unable to bear the pressure. For others, the station was cursed, and the evil that inhabited it had finally claimed Ingrid. No one knew the truth, but fear lingered.
The Hegnes Fjord station closed soon after, abandoned like a grim reminder of the village's darkest nights. No one spoke of Ingrid or Kjell again, but some villagers claimed that on stormy nights, you could still hear the eerie laughter echoing through the walls of the old station.
The cell where Kjell was being held was small and cold, with a narrow metal bed and a window barred with iron rods. Snow had piled up on the outside ledge, and the wind battered the glass, creating a hollow, constant sound. Kjell sat on the bed, staring at the floor with the same vacant expression he had during the interrogation. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the events of the previous night. But every time he did, the image of Ingrid falling toward the tracks returned with brutal clarity, accompanied by the mocking laughter of the entity. Then a soft noise broke the silence, a knock at the window. Kjell's eyes snapped open, turning toward the glass. At first he saw nothing, just the snow swirling against the pane. But then he saw it. The figure was there, just outside the window, watching him with its unnaturally elongated face and that grotesque smile, as if mocking his pain. Its body seemed to hover, wrapped in shadows that writhed against the blizzard. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then the entity raised a hand, waving at him with a slow, deliberate gesture.
Kjell jumped to his feet, moving closer to the window, but before he could do anything, the figure began to fade. The shadows surrounding it scattered like smoke, and its smile was the last thing to disappear, leaving only the raging snowstorm as a witness.
Kjell stood there, staring into the darkness of the night, while a single word echoed in his mind, clear, mocking, though no one had spoken it aloud.
Always.
The cold seeped into his cell, but Kjell no longer felt it. He could only think about what he had seen and what he now knew was inevitable. He hadn't been arrested for the murders, but the true culprit was still out there, waiting for its next move.